Okay, terrific. Thank you, Zach. And we have Megan. All right. So we have our speakers here, and as we've done 3 times before today, we're going to turn this part of the session over to the committee for questions. So, the floor is open.
Yeah, Paul Turner from Yale. This is a question for Zach. I like the framework of, maybe what we have in place already can help us move forward if we want to have the assurance that this stuff is going to be compliant. I'm not quite convinced that you could swiftly convene a committee together and have the right kind of expertise, right? Because treating something like a vertically transmitted parasite, but it's not really a vertically transmitted parasite, may mean that, we're all increasingly reductionist in terms of our approach to science, so we know our systems very well, but we can't as easily, maybe nimbly move over to other systems. Should I just not be worried about that? So it's not as if you're going to convene together an IBC that have people who have had prior experience necessarily with gene drive mechanisms, even though they are providing the oversight at a university to make sure that.
Well, the IBC is a standing body, so it's convened all the time. It meets regularly.
But my understanding is the people who are on that are reviewing protocols that are at least close enough to what they do that their expertise works.
Right.
And I guess my concern is that gene drive mechanisms are really so much on the frontier of what is possible. It may be hard to convene locally at all universities the proper expertise, but maybe I'm just pessimistic.
Yeah, like I said, most of the protocols we review are going to involve some sort of recombinant pathogen at level 2, level 3. And, gene drive sounds scary until you have to get in a room, and start handling, a needle full of tuberculosis or a needle full of yellow fever virus or some other deadly pathogen. And so they take containment pretty seriously in that regard. So laboratory experiments, I think we can, between the facilities, design, training, and monitoring and surveillance, a containment I don't think is that much of an issue. You have to take it very seriously, but it's not something that we have a strong gap. We have a great precedent for biocontainment in this country in terms of these pathogens that can be applied here, but we run into a real bottleneck after that. But IBC members may not see the same parallel, so they may think of the research as fundamentally different, but I don't in terms of containment.
I have a follow-up on that.
Go ahead, Megan.
I think one of the difficulties is relying upon a lot of anecdotes, but anecdotally from people who are developing these technologies, I hear that their confidence in their local IBCs is not terribly high. But for the vast majority of issues, that provides, an important infrastructure to get expertise and guidance, but that whether it exists or not, their trust in the capacity of their local institutional needs to be able to know, especially on environmental issues, it's not there. So at least anecdotally, it doesn't exist. I haven't seen great data when it comes to the overall sort of fidelity of that system to be able to identify and recognize issues, but I would be interested in that.
Go ahead, Wayne.
So, Wayne Landis, Western Washington University. So I just heard 3 talks, all talked about risk to some degree, or impact assessment, which included in that could be a risk assessment. I spent a while now looking for actual risk assessments with genetically engineered organisms or something similar to that. And except for the case where you have containment, like for human health, I can't find them. Now, this is in accessible literature. I also have had a lot of experience being the editor for the ecological risk assessment editor for risk analysis and being on editorial boards for other risk-oriented journals, finding peer-reviewed risk assessments that could be used as models for this. And I guess I'm asking, where's the beef, or in this case, where are the ecological risk assessments, if this is actually being done? I'm also looking for something that's actually done in a modern sense. Huge amount of papers written about it in the late 1990s, early 2000s. But that's like a while ago. As far as risk, the science of risk assessment is concerned. So if you guys are talking about how they're required, would you please send me the citations for when they're actually available and transparent enough so that they're citable as well.
I'll follow up on this. I think this, one of the slides that I very quickly skipped through were some quotes from individuals that I've worked with, and two pertinent ones to this were, and sort of I made a plea around the need to invest in regulatory science, and sort of had somebody from a prominent research institution come back and say, right, well, that's boring. We couldn't even hire into a position in regulatory science. And so there's one issue that comes, and from the same side, somebody working within a regulatory agency that does risk assessment worried about recruiting talent. And so I think there's an issue culturally in terms of the people who might be developing these and other technologies, recognizing, and it's, again, the legitimacy of that type of work. The second one is, I think there is, as a practitioner, again, trying to interface with folks who have your expertise, really understanding and getting access to the most prominent data. And I've interacted with startup founders that are working on very low resource conditions and trying to understand how they navigate this landscape. And they also come back with suggestions saying, you know, we're dealing with problems in understanding the precedent that exists and getting access to the best practices on our particular use. So I think the accessibility of data pertaining to precedents of risk assessment is a key problem. But again, it extends well beyond just the mandate of this committee, so there's a big question on where the recommendations will go.
Could I just ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
When you say risk assessment, you're talking about risk assessments of releases of gene drive containing organisms, or?
Yes.
I mean, what exactly are we talking
Risk assessment specifically to genetically modified organisms, actual risk assessments, not discussions. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing that I can find on gene drives specifically. There's just now being some papers talking about potential models talking about that. So something that would apply to the document that we're preparing. So I'm looking for information. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, first of all, my task and my expertise, such as it is or isn't, is to the vessels in which such things might be put, not the actual things that would be put in them. And so I think other members of the audience would probably be in a better position to talk about what's actually been put in these vessels. But if you take a look at the Cartagena protocols webpage, I believe that there's a risk assessment about genetically engineered mosquitoes.
Right. Of course,
and again, you would know more about that than I do, because this is.
Well, the criteria I'm trying to use in this room is something that's actually peer reviewed. That has met all the criteria of traditional science, and not just, well, it's a web page or it's a gray literature. And that's one of the biggest issues I'm having is gray literature, and also transparency. What was actually done? And Zach, I know you've probably had to run the same things. Here's a literature, here's something going on. Is it transparent enough so you can actually make a decision? And I don't call it regulatory science, we call it decision science, and how people make decisions. And I think that's part of the problem with recruiting people. Also, there's math involved, and we're biologists. And sometimes those things don't go together as well as you would hope. Unlike engineers, often biologists are not required to take calculus. So, especially the older ones.
So from our perspective.
Okay, I know Jason wanted to comment, but Joyce, were you on this point or a different one?
It was on the point of the Cartagena Protocol, so not unrelated. But,
Then we'll go to Jason.
I noted Megan's introduction saying you were interested in what happens when the regulation hits the ground. And I also heard David Wirth say he wished that the US would sign up to the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Cartagena Protocol, and presumably also the Nagoya Protocol. What I hear from a lot of other people is that the Convention on Biological Diversity, with its rather extreme interpretation of the precautionary principle and its reliance on regulation of the process and not the product, has led to very severe difficulties for people who actually want to develop GM technologies in Europe and Africa and other parts of the world, and that the current discussions in the COP around how the GM regulations under the Convention on Biological Diversity can be interpreted or not in the context of synthetic biology has led to some, so far only at the proposal level and not necessarily adopted, but rather extreme interpretations of a precautionary approach to synthetic biology. I just wondered whether we should be looking at what happens when the regulation hits the ground for some of these United Nations instruments that are being very widely adopted throughout the world, and maybe look at a more adaptive approach to governance that would, once the precautionary principle has been in existence for a certain amount of time and there is clearly no risk, there should be provisions somewhere in these kinds of instruments to reduce the level of precaution that needs to be applied.
David, do you
Is
want to
that
take it?
directed to me?
It was,
Okay.
on the Cartagena Protocol.
All right. Well, for one thing, if you think about it, if the concern is that the views of some countries or one country are not being reflected in the forum, for that country to refuse to participate in the forum is not a very effective strategy for having its views heard. And so one often hears criticisms of not just this international setting, but others, as somehow having gone off track or taken some, excuse me, but pathological turn of some sort. And I think that gives too much, it sort of anthropomorphizes the entity much more than it deserves to be. It's just the collective will, excuse me, it's just the collective will of all the states parties that are there. And from now putting on my sort of advocate's hat, the way to change those views is to work with national governments and to turn them around. I mean, this is not the first time that I've heard this sort of criticism about the CBD or other settings as well. I mean, the multilateral agreement on trade in hazardous waste is also subject to a similar criticism. And so the problem is the way the governments of the planet are processing this particular problem. And if they need more education or they need to rethink it, then the public and particularly the scientific communities in those countries should work on those governments and get something that, at least from your point of view, would be more rational. I hope that's a helpful answer. The alternative is to walk away, which I think is not an alternative at all, because the consequences of lack of coordination and the consequences of lack of harmonization are potentially quite serious. So I think the solution to the problem you're describing is to put more effort into working on the particular forum, and maybe for scientists to put their heads together and in a strategic way to communicate those views in an effective way to the government's concerned.
All right, thanks. Jason?
Jason Delborn from NC State. Thank you for your presentations. First, a question from David Winikoff, asking remotely, and then I have a question too. David's question, I think, is for Zach. Does the private sector have a corollary system? So are there private IBCs like there are private IRBs?
They are encouraged to form their own IBCs. If they don't receive NIH money, they're not required to do so, but they are encouraged to do so. But we don't have oversight over that.
But there's no legal framework.
There's no legal framework for that, no. If they receive NIH money, then they have to. They're bound by that. But if they don't, then they're not bound by that.
Okay, the second question is perhaps for Zach and Megan and maybe for David as well. I noted at the end of your presentation, Zach, that you said, once we're out of the laboratory, all these helpful guidelines and all this expertise on the IBC committees is suddenly evaporated and it's not there. Do we lose an opportunity if we're building capacity to oversee this new innovation of gene drives within the laboratory, and then all of a sudden it goes to the next phase of testing, and all of that expertise is invisible? That seems like a lost opportunity. How might we transfer some of that conversation or some of that expertise to the level of oversight of field experiments, field trials, things like that?
And this comes back to the question that Wayne was asking. What does an environmental impact statement look like for these technologies? What does it look like? Who reviews it? We just don't have it, and so we don't know what was going to happen because we don't know what should be in that document, and we don't know who to show it to, who should review it, and who should approve it. We just don't have that pathway.
I'll speak to this because we're just finishing the experiment, if you will, of running this NSF Engineering Research Center, and one of the key benefits of a center like that does combine 30 now academic labs and 40 plus companies is it provides a very unique forum for exchange of information and expertise of of the practice between a policy and actually executing it in the real world, and investment in the networks to give often informal guidance on who to talk to if you have a question has shown itself. Again, most of this is not captured. It's mostly anecdotes of individuals who have made significant progress in being able to understand who do I talk to, USDA or EPA or who, and get that careful attention to their particular issue. And so I think we're seeing that informally, and there isn't nothing, when there's development of products, which is, again, the type of market forces that are also shaping this. There are many other triggers in the types of regulatory structures that are invoked, but there I don't think has been sufficient attention paid to how you connect experts in that nimble way, and why they would want to be connected in the first place. And so even though there's lots of criticism and struggles in trying to embed this policy research agenda within the development of technology, I think it's vitally important to not lose that precedent and to continue to try to develop these forums. So it's not captured, but it's crucial.
Lisa.
Good. Hi, Lisa Tannehill. I'm from the University of Maryland. And I just wanted to ask Megan and Zach and David if you could also weigh in on this, the following. At the end of your presentation, Megan, you were talking about sort of the expense associated with establishing this regulatory infrastructure, I believe. And I'm just curious where you might think, or you all as a group collectively think, that money should come from, and whether that's something that should then be provided to a local IBC at an institution to help instill more confidence in that group to make these decisions about gene drive research, whether it should be carried out, or is this something we should consider giving to an alternative body that is formed that would then exist outside of the context of the institution that would then evaluate the technology?
make some brief comments. So I think there's a number of interlinked issues here, and it's not just a function of the quantity of money, but it's the quality and how it's distributed. I think one key issue, at least in the U.S., is just around leadership and examples of who do we point to as being the responsible person. And that's not necessarily a money issue, that's a leadership issue. I do think that coupling of research programs and to funding in this area is really important. There's a number of, I need to reference the right study, but a term often used to production science versus impact science, and really understanding and developing the tools alongside the technology. So as we're seeing more money come in for places like DARPA or NSF or NIH, is really coupling that funding alongside development. And I do think one of the difficult things is the way in which the money around funding programs is prescribed. So there was a lot of internal difficulties with, this is research funds, but often what's underlying the capacity of that research to be put to good ends are administrative capacities that are often overlooked or not properly resourced or not resourced on long enough timescales to capture institutional expertise. And so that's a systematic problem, in that the sort of knowledge transfer or brokering, you call it what you want, is not resourced within those centers.
And I'll just, from an institutional point of view, so everybody knows that IACUC and IRB, so IACUC is there to protect animals from researchers, and IRB is there to protect human subjects from researchers. And in order to get an NIH grant funded, you have to have those protocols approved at your institution before NIH will send any money to your institution. So the institution is strongly incentivized to make sure that those programs are working effectively and in a rapid way, because they want that grant money. IBC is not like that. Okay? You can get your NIH grant, but from the IBC's perspective and from NIH's perspective, you're just not allowed to start those experiments until you have approval. So the institutions are de-incentivized to put money and resources into IBCs, to administration to run the IBCs, to inspectors to go to labs and take care of biosafety issues. And so we find that we're stretched, and we could do better if we had more resources that come from the indirect costs associated with grants. But because NIH does not mandate that, the institution does not prioritize that compared to how they do IACUC and IRB.
I just comment on one small piece of the question, which is capacity building in low and middle income countries. The Convention on Biological Diversity, at least in theory, has a financial mechanism which ought to support the development of that kind of expertise within those countries, particularly to help with the sorts of issues we were hearing about identified by the speakers in the previous panel. It doesn't sound from, I don't know what the figures are, but it doesn't sound from those presentations as if there's a lot of international money flowing in. Compare that to climate change, where the pressure coming from those same countries is enormous, and it's actually producing results from the basically industrialized countries to provide funding. So there are precedents for mobilizing fairly large amounts of money. It just seems, the difference seems to be that this issue doesn't have the same high public profile that the climate change issue does, but there are precedents for multilateral funding. Now, they're the same, similar issues to the ones that Megan identified, which is efficacy and choices in terms of how it's spent. Those are huge issues, and they're even bigger on the international level. But at least the first step is at least to mobilize the funds, and the countries concerned, in fact, know how to do it.
Just offer one last point in terms of funding. The public funding around public funding is vital, but at least the companies that we have dealt with, over this sort of 10-year period also do recognize the need for continuing to invest in this area. And my other wish is that also on the side of, say, insurance providers and other bodies also recognize these very long-term sort of trajectories on which they need to assess risks, but it's often having an organization that exists on that timescale between the research environment and that private entity that's the missing gap.
All right, Liz, last question to you.
So this is to start with for Zach, but anyone on the panel can also chime in. In 1999-2000, OPRR, Office of Protection of Research Risk, shut down 20 major research universities because their IRBs were, to put the best spin on it, overwhelmed, and they couldn't actually read the protocols, and although they had the expertise, they didn't have the time and the funding wasn't there to buy out their effort to give them the time. At what point do you think IBCs are going to reach a similar critical point, and who at NIH would be, perhaps NSABB, but who would be the ones that would say the reviews are not adequate, we need to stop doing this until such time as universities, institutions take it seriously, and then where will the money come from?
Right, so that's a wonderful question, because that happened 4 years ago at Virginia Tech. So NIH does
Which
audits.
is why you're here?
Which is why
you know what you know.
So I became chair after that audit, but NIH, they audit institutions, they look at everything, they look at the minutes of the IBC meetings, they look at the whole structure, all the resources universities are putting in, and they do an audit, and if they find deficiencies, then the institution will have a limited window to fix those deficiencies before they pull the plug. And that's what happened to Virginia Tech. And now we have much more resources than we did 4 years ago to manage these protocols. It's still not at the level of IACUC or IRB, but it's happened at least on a case-by-case basis. I don't know how much resources NIH is able to invest in auditing individual universities. You can see by the number of IBCs that we've had, that explosion from 200 to 900. I don't think they're able to inspect all of them regularly, and so that's definitely going to be an issue.
And with regard to that, not to be too personal, but do you have effort and salary support for your work?
As chair, no. I'm a voluntary chair.
Yeah, and therein is the rub.
And I'll also add that, again, on the resources and research agenda, advanced decision support, decision analysis tools, and the development of those and prioritization of that research, including development of metrics to support risk analysis, is going to be important as the scale of these capacities increase and spread beyond traditional institutions.
Okay, terrific. With that, let's thank the panel, if you would, please.